Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM review. We finally made it to the last but certainly not the least of the Cheetah Girls movies. For over a year now, I've been driving the message home about the quality of this particular movie. Heck, my third ever video proclaimed it the most underrated DCOM of all time. But after rewatching it, does this film hold up? Well, as we often do, let's take a closer look. Not really much to spoil, but spoiler warning anyways. With all that said, let's dive into Cheetah Girls One World. Start things off, as we always do with these movies, with a musical number. This time, it's Cheetah Love. It's an okay number, not really at the same level of how the second film opened, but definitely not the worst song. Although you have to say, it is kind of hilarious how one of the song's lyrics is strength in numbers, considering, yeah. But we'll talk plenty about how Raven's absence helps make this movie what it is. So, the Cheetah Girls, recently turned trio, are auditioning in the hope of still taking off musically. And here's where the movie first proves that it's being directed by, oh yes, you guessed it, the man, the myth, the legend. When we talk Paul, you already know by now there's a ton of intelligence and artistry in even the most minor details. The trio right now is struggling with Galleria taking summer classes, which makes a ton of sense because they've never been a trio before, and more than that, they've never been without their leader. So of course, they probably start looking a little less impressive in addition to having genuine concerns about their future as a musical group. It's a pretty meta-narrative in that way, since this was the case in real life too, once it became clear that Raven would not return for the third film. Getting back to the plot, the girls get a call from what they believe is a Hollywood director as they audition for a young aspiring film school graduate named Vic. They nail their auditions, once again, using that smooth setting transition that I love, but it's revealed that Vic really meant Bollywood. But after some convincing from Chanel, the Cheetahs agree, despite Vic only requiring one girl, which, as we all know, comes up in a very major way later on. It's here where Chanel really establishes herself as the de facto leader of the group. Not a surprising turn by any means, but I do like how the movie never even once feels tempted to directly compare her leadership style to Galleria's. So, then the Cheetah Girls travel to India, and wow. I know I've praised Paul Hoen's camera work, amongst many other things, plenty of times before, but these shots are gorgeous. He does better than any director at bringing a setting to life, and he proves it once again here in probably the best use of establishing shots in any DCOM ever made. So the Cheetahs end up tying their wishes for this new adventure to a tree. And yes, this is an actual Indian cultural custom. They did their homework here. But more impressive still is how big a role the philosophy behind that piece of culture plays in establishing the narrative of this film. But we'll get there. So they get to the set, meet a few people, and then we're introduced to Geeta, the lead dancer of this production. It was smart to have her and Dorinda start off in conflict, not just because Do has been established as the resident dancer and choreographer for the group, but because we already know that things with her and Joaquin are stressed at this moment, so it's reasonable to have her become uncharacteristically aggressive. This leads to the first truly great number from this film, Dance Me If You Can. Just look at the way this is filmed. It's like every other shot is a painting, and filming with just the right sunset angle really brings it all home. You can take or leave the song itself, I personally really like it, but the way the scene is set here is everything, and that aspect only gets better throughout this movie. But then things fall apart quickly when Vic's uncle/movie producer stresses the fact that there is only room in the budget for one star. The Cheetahs would have to challenge each other to obtain that single spot, so they decide to just leave. This leads to the song Fly Away, which is just kind of there. Anyways, Aqua has been chatting up this tech support guy for a little bit prior to coming to India, and wouldn't you know it, he's right there in India, which honestly isn't even as much of a stretch as Gabriella transferring to East High, but the move to bring Amar into the movie works well to give Aqua an actual character, something that's more evident here than in the last two films put together. Their blooming relationship is somewhat but not directly paralleled by Chanel gradually growing closer to Vic. This leads to Dorinda trying to help Rahim out with speaking to Geeta. And yes, it's one of those things where they both like each other but they're both awkward as hell, but it's passable because it never becomes overly focused on. This leads into a pair of songs almost back to back. First, with Chanel struggling to determine how hard she should try in these auditions. That seems like a weird and rather arrogant angle to take, quite honestly, but okay. But the song, even though it's just passable, does just enough to inform us that she does still care about the Cheetahs as a cohesive unit. Then, we get to the next song, Feels Like Love, which is more or less exactly what you'd expect. Chanel and Aqua are having the time of their lives in India, while Dorinda is being left out on the count of a bad experience, which, again, makes a ton of sense, especially with how her character will eventually resolve in this film. So things aren't going so well in the movie-making division, as Vic has gone over budget and is at risk of losing his film and being forced to drill cavities for a living. But luckily, Amar has a pretty nice place for them to film for free. Okay, that's more than a little convenient, but it does help set up maybe the most intelligent part of the movie later on. But before that, can we just appreciate how good Paul Hogan is with the camera? This movie absolutely pops off the screen in ways that no DCOM before it or since has even come close to doing. So now, we're in the final third of the film where the pace speeds up a bit to resolve things properly. Now, let's break down the genius of Paul Hogan here as we go through the events that set up the six-way performance that is I'm the One. Firstly, Vic likes Chanel. That was established very early on. He's also the director and nephew to the producer, giving him quite a bit of pull. His movie falls on hard times, and who saves him? Amar does, with his free-to-use pristine cultural hotspot. And now, the politics have shifted a bit, and he's got some leverage, which, as a direct result, gives more preference to Aqua, who he likes technically before the movie even begins. Dorinda isn't interested in any guy in this instance, but helping out Raheem does lend itself to preferential treatment as well, namely because it was confirmed early on that he's a huge Bollywood star, so he's got leverage as well. But it goes one layer deeper than even that. Amar makes that power play on Vic, convincing Vic that Aqua is playing dirty, which he tells Chanel about, and of course, Vic wouldn't assume anything of her since they like each other, which was already suspicious to the other two before now, which in part fosters Aqua hesitantly agreeing to Amar's power play in the first place before Dorinda is seen helping the star of the film. Whew. This film builds up the characters in specific and brilliant ways to make this competition not just something the Cheetah sisters would agree to, but would give their all to win. And in doing so, it finally captures both tension and conflict properly, something the other two films never grasped nearly as well, especially the second. And it didn't even have to be organized as intelligently as it was, with a number of varying and nuanced characters, dynamics, and priorities in place. But I don't call this guy the man, the myth, and the legend for nothing. And all of this is in part why I'm the One is one of the best DCOM songs ever made. It not only caps off that conflict, but it's also a brilliant response to the question of who really does take center stage once Raven isn't bossing everyone around anymore. Chanel seems like the obvious choice, and the movie knows that, which not only leads to her winning, but winning in no small part because of her connection to Vic, the most important new character, and, just like Chanel herself, also kind of a new leader, what with being a director for the first time. And then, that scene ends with a sample from It's Over, the song that almost meant the end for the Cheetahs back in the second movie. Brilliant reincorporation of music. But then, we take a step back into another song, No Place Like Us, where Paul takes a break from the complex narrative designs and reminds us that the Cheetahs are sisters first, a theme embroiled into all three movies in one way or another. So Chanel doesn't end up taking the part, and instead, Geeta becomes the leading lady both on-screen and off-screen for Raheem. So now Vic, having stood up to his uncle, can finally make the movie he wants to make. And oh, come on. Really, Paul? Really? You already made the most beautiful, culturally vibrant DCOM ever, and you mess around and perfectly film one of the most beautifully captured DCOM songs too? You got me, Paul. Once again, I'm in awe of your work. Needless to say, one of the best closing numbers in any DCOM, but also a great closing number for the Cheetah Girls as a franchise, who really have taken us all around the world while still holding on to their most important and definitive traits. And now, the characters. One World does what only a handful of DCOMs have been able to do, make the most of its setting. The minor characters and even the walk-ons help convey a culturally vibrant aesthetic. They actually went to India to film this thing, and it shows. This movie does not miss a chance to embrace the culture, the majesty, and the many colors. Such a beautiful movie. Roshan Seth, who plays Uncle Kamal here, is perfect in his role. He's funny, expressive, strict, and it's clear that he knows what he's doing, even if he can be a bit cheap. And considering how poor Disney Channel can sometimes be with cultural representation, this genuine performance from an Indian native was great to see. The trio of males that are, in one way or another, connected to the three Cheetah Girls aren't too much to speak of acting-wise. Vic has his moments, but the others come off just a little bit flat. There's honestly not too much to say about them outside of what you know happened in the movie, but in the case of Vic, it's at least nice to see that film creators as main characters always deliver smart DCOMs. But before we talk about the Cheetahs that actually did return for this movie, let's address the elephant in the room. Right? Oh, you're too kind. I know, funny, right? Oh, stop it. What I said in my previous reviews, I stand by. Raven was just too much in the first film, but she proved to be an effective leader in the second. A lot of people criticize this movie for not having Raven-Symoné in it, but I think those people are wrong, or at the very least, are completely missing the larger point. The fact of the matter is that they were able to create a lot of the clever tension and drama directly because Raven isn't there. We know what she brings, we know what she can do, and it's because that focused leader is missing that the Cheetahs realistically go through not just an existential crisis of sorts, but also end up being suspicious of each other. You'll notice that those things never happened in the first two movies. In the original, Galleria quickly became the problem, so her ego was the only real issue just in terms of the group dynamic. And in the second, the group was awestruck by Spain, so the problem became everyone except Galleria. But what Paul does here is create the smartest possible tension by introducing us to a struggling trio of cheetahs who now have an opportunity they didn't before, to be the lead in a movie, both this movie and the movie within the movie. Years before Jeffrey Hornaday would go on to improve on the idea of film inception basically, Paul created the general concept and used it masterfully, as he tends to do with any idea. So now that we've set the table, let's dig into the cheetahs that are actually here. Keely Williams finally has a character. Thank the Lord. It only took the greatest director on the network and 3 whole films to figure out a place for Aquanet. And the character she has here works because she's proven to be kind of whimsical and all over the place, so falling in love with a voice on the phone seems like something she'd do. The whole acting better than everyone else thing does seem to come out of nowhere, but she does kind of act differently in the other movies as well, at times jumping from serious to jovial to smart to airheaded. So it does make some sense based on what we've seen from Aqua to be the actor, at least relative to the more heavily defined traits that the others represent. So not surprisingly, Keely had her best performance as a Cheetah Girl in this movie. I wouldn't call it an exceptional performance per se, but she did do some good things with the added space her character got here. The best thing they did with Chanel here is just assuming that she could easily slide into the leadership role, especially since it was always pretty obvious who the group's number 2 was before now, and she does pretty well in that role for the most part. They also structured her character in such a way that her leadership style was in line with the character she's always been. That smartly avoids the whole new leader becomes dictator-like and then settles down later cliche. But it's also because she's less authoritative than Galleria ever was that the cheetahs are drawn into conflict, which again shows how this movie not only understands how the dynamics of these characters work, but also how they would most likely change. I can't stress enough just how much homework Paul and the production team did here to get these minor details right, because they end up making a huge difference in the final product. Overall, Adrienne Bailon isn't as good here compared to the other 2 movies, but I do like where they went with her character. But just like in the original, the MVP has to be Sabrina Bryan as Dorinda. I'm never going to deny that I adore Sabrina or that she's my favorite Cheetah Girl, but I also think that her character arc is the most important thing about this film outside of the stunning visuals. Not that Sabrina herself isn't visually stunning. Okay, I'm focused. It's out of my system. Anyways, we know about her former relationship from the second movie, and as a direct result, she's not in the best of places throughout this film. This manifests itself in many ways, including being very aggressive near the start and being reluctant to recognize the moment throughout the film. I love how they parallel her advice to Raheem with the call she gets from Joaquin. And here, it's all about the details. She's not playing matchmaker in that overly typical, hyper-energetic, love is in the air sort of way. She's actually slightly annoyed at how dorky Raheem is, even though she's a little easier on Geeta. She wants to see them together, but this movie also understands where she's at personally, so they never made her too excited by the possibility of any relationship in this movie, even the one she's responsible for fostering. And then, her arc ends in the second best possible way, with her realizing that she was her own obstacle and needed to get out of her own way to at least begin talking things out with her former boyfriend. I say second best because I think they could have downplayed that scene even more, made it even more subtle, maybe not even use words and just let Sabrina's expressions take over. But thank God they had the restraint to not go overboard and have Joaquin just randomly appear in India and things are just all of a sudden okay. They already kind of played that card with Aqua and Amar, so it would have been just facepalm inducing here. But overall, Dorinda's sterner outlook in the aftermath of the second movie was a brilliant place to take her character, and Sabrina Bryan, as usual, really made it work. And that's One World. So, what's the verdict? One World is a sensational visual presentation where every frame feels like it's trying to actively beat out the last, and often does so. Paul Hohen is already a proven artist when it comes to capturing emotional expression, but here he proves his mastery of visual expression in the most bafflingly beautiful DCOM ever conceived. You thought Kenny Ortega embraced Spain's visuals? Well, he did. And he did it very well, but not even his camera work there holds a candle to Paul's camera work here. And what's more is that the movie doesn't stop there. It incorporates so much Indian culture into the plot, the music, the dancing, and the narrative, providing what is likely to be a lot of people's first look at India, and it goes even beyond the markets and the people and the colors and the festivals because of this tree and the man under it. By introducing him and having Dorinda learn more about not just the culture, but the mindset of the new location, it makes India more than a setting, more than a location, but a necessary part of her character development. This film is also structured well behind the culture and the visuals. The cheetahs are more boy-centric than in any film before, yes, but the movie has enough room to do that here with just 3 of them. And even though their relationships end up becoming large plot points, it never goes against the girl power message they were singing about years prior, because they still make their own choices, and more vitally, the men learn to do the same thing as a direct result. If anything, having these relationships on hand helps foster the idea of female empowerment, because the trio of guys become empowered in various and important ways because of the girls themselves. Do I even need to say it anymore? This movie knew exactly what it was doing from the opening note. That having been said, this movie isn't perfect by any means, and some of the flaws are noteworthy. The soundtrack has its high points, about 3 to be exact, but the rest is just lacking. And a lot of that probably has to do with Whitney Houston not being a producer here like she was for the vastly superior soundtracks that defined the first 2 films. But, if nothing else, the way Dance Me If You Can and One World as musical numbers are presented on screen are breathtaking. This sunset is freaking perfect, and even the lesser songs have at least a somewhat interesting presentation style that gives the number its own life and charm. But I do feel like a lot more could have been done on that end. Overall, not as good as any of the bigger name DCOM musical soundtracks, but pretty solid in terms of its film incorporation and presentation. This film also struggles a bit in the acting department. It's not aggressively bad, it's just kind of blah a lot of the times. And that's partly why there's not a ton to say about the trio of guys. The movie structures their involvement very well, giving them all a part to play and a hurdle to clear. But in making such a sensible construct, I think it lost out on some screen presence this time around. I don't think anybody phoned it in necessarily, but I do think it could have been much better, and I would say that the original Cheetah Girls have both its sequels beat in that area. But even without the emotions of the first film or the powerful songs of the second, the third Cheetah film is undoubtedly the best in terms of visual presentation, novel character dynamics, narrative design, plot resolution, and cultural competency. That's almost every area that matters, which is why One World is also easily the best film in the Cheetah trilogy, period. It doesn't have as much glamour, prestige, or popularity, but none of that matters as much as the traits it does have that do surpass the other films. It took a relatively smaller idea, placed it in a lesser known country, and did more with less. Literally, all 3 movies in the trilogy feel different because of having 3 different directors. Oz Scott captured the urban New York feel very well, and it plays out similar to how Dwayne Dunham might have directed the film. Kenny Ortega brought a signature flair for exceptional choreography, which also helped create what I believe to be one of the best DCOM soundtracks ever. But here, you've got the undisputed champ coming in with no Raven and no promise of continued interest in the franchise, since remember, High School Musical and Camp Rock are the new kings by 2008, and he still does what he does best, makes a really good film. It's not all great all the time, and some of the same plot contrivances that infect all the Cheetah movies are present here too, but the difference is that Paul does what no other director can. He takes those points and makes them matter, gives them purpose, and doesn't just plug them in to be lazy. But still, the overall soundtrack and acting do hurt this movie, and the at times too slow pace through the first hour or so make the resolutions feel more rushed than they should have been. I'd be lying if I said this was one of Paul's best films. Visually it is, but he tends to do a lot better when he has better actors and acting. Overall, I'd say it's somewhere around where Read It and Weep is, which, not surprisingly, is also a criminally underrated flick. But we'll talk about that Paul and gem after we get to my DCOM passion project a little later on. All in all, One World is the best film of the Cheetah franchise, followed closely by the first. It's a well-layered, intelligently devised movie that not only allows the characters to grow, but does well in continuing to emphasize the global perspective these movies help inspire. The trilogy as a whole has no shortage of problems, but all 3 movies help bolster that all-encompassing narrative by showcasing the beauty of their respective settings on multiple fronts, and considering how bad, just downright awful some musical movies can get thanks to talentless hacks, if nothing else, the Cheetah Girls were special, and nowhere is that point better expressed both visually and narratively than in One World. But, as I often say, the only way to know for sure is to give it a watch and decide for yourself. And of course, thanks for watching.